So good afternoon and a big welcome to Dr. Robert Mcpherson, who's a research associate with a partnership for work health and safety, a partnership between WorkSafeBC and the University of British Columbia. Robert holds a PhD in human geography from the University of St. Andrews, and he completed his postdoctoral fellowship in occupational health with the partnership. Robert's research interests include comparative research on return to work and after work related injury and the effectiveness of occupational health and safety management systems and workplace safety inspections, which I believe is what he's going to talk to us about today. So Robert, please go ahead and unmute and feel free to get started.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted correctly? Yeah, it looks like I have.
We can hear you just fine.
So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to present some of the work I've been doing with colleagues Masood Yosefi and Christopher McLeod. This is work that is in collaboration with WorkSafeBC that we've been sort of developing over the last year or so, making use of a survey that's conducted by WorkSafeBC with employer and worker representatives of workplaces that were inspected by WorkSafeBC prevention officers. And today I'm going to be focusing on determining hazard management changes in workplaces following these inspections. So I think based on the audience, I think most of you probably have some idea of what's involved in a workplace health and safety inspection and why we have them. But perhaps as a kind of reminder for some of you, or just for those you don't know, this is a kind of tool which is help prevent injuries and create safer workplaces. So here in BC, injury rates have been declining for about 2 decades, but there's still a burden that remains in terms of workplace injuries and fatalities. So to give you an idea of the scale of it, there's about 158,000 workplace injuries that were reported in 2019, and over 200 fatalities as well during the same year. And the financial costs in terms of claim costs for these injuries is over 1.3 billion Canadian dollars. So although the trends are sort of declining, there's still a burden there, and there's still a role for injury prevention. And so to kind of reduce occupational workplace injuries, government and quasi-government agencies regulate employers with the goal of making workplaces safer. So these regulations have a variety of kind of uses, and one of them is in terms of financial externalities, like preventing the transfer of costs of the worker injuries to the worker and society, and then more so providing a form of instruction for achieving safety interventions. So here in BC, WorkSafeBC is under the legislative mandate of the Workers' Compensation Act. They have control over the occupational health and safety regulations and the guidelines that go with them. But for safety regulations to be effective, workplaces need to be in compliance with them. And so without this sort of functioning system to back the regulations up, they're not going to be effective at making workplaces safer and reducing injuries. As part of that, there's various prevention activities to try and encourage compliance, and inspections are one of them. So they provide an opportunity to sort of gain first-hand knowledge of what's going on in the workplaces, as well as detect safety infractions and also like transfer safety information to these workplaces. So to give you a bit more idea about what goes on with WorkSafeBC inspections, firms are kind of typically chosen for inspections, and they're kind of planned. And there are several strategies for WorkSafeBC to target firms, and such as like they have a high risk strategy where they target firms which are in sectors which typically have higher rates of injury or poorer safety records. But there's also, you can also have response inspections. So that could be where WorkSafeBC has been notified by an employer, or not an employer, more like an employee. So it's more like a complaint-driven type of inspection. But generally speaking, the inspections are unannounced. I think in some rare cases, the prevention officer will have to provide up to 24 hours notice to the employer ahead of the inspection. But generally that's not the case. And during the inspection, prevention officers undertake a series of activities, such as kind of taking observations of the workplace and the work that goes on, conducting interviews with employer and worker representatives, as well as perhaps members of joint health and safety committees, doing inspections of their records. And also at the end of each inspection, they provide a report to the employer. But in the event of non-compliance with regulation, there's a series of kind of measures which the prevention officer may apply. And so one of them is an OHS compliance order. And so you get oral orders as well as written orders. So if it's a very minor infraction, it's possible like that would just be an oral order, which the employer could actually resolve before the end of the inspection, but then other actual written orders will be in the report, and they will remain until the actual workplace has remedied the infraction. In more serious instances, you would have warning letters, and they tend to be a precursor for when there's kind of financial penalties that have been applied to workplaces. So you can have OHS citations, which are almost like small financial penalties, which are, I think, maximum of just over $1,000. But then in most extreme cases, you've got administrative penalties, which may be due to like substantial kind of negligence by the employer in terms of health and safety, and maybe that's led to the death of workers. There's also stop work orders as well, and injunctions. So, but these are very extreme cases, which are, I think, in general, there's maybe penalties are given out in 1 in every 100 inspections. So I'll take this opportunity to run the first audience poll. I'd be interested to know what you think, which prevention activity contributed to the most prevention hours in 2019. Was it A, education, B, consultation, C, inspection, D, investigation, E, or other?
We usually wait till we've got about 80% of the vote, if not more. Things are coming in fast here.
It's really interesting so far.
Let's give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to end this and share the results.
Okay.
And I've stopped sharing.
Okay. Were the audience able to see that? Or I can click share results, right? Would that work?
Yes, everyone should have been able to see it, but
you should have been able to see it. So yeah, the audience voted inspection with 35%, closely followed by education, consultation. And I'll stop sharing this. It's really interesting. So what the answer actually is inspection. So that 35% pat on the back, you got the right answer. More specifically, WorkSafeBC prevention officers dedicated about 217,000 hours on on inspection. So that's actually 72% of all prevention activities. So so it shows that there's a lot of investment into inspections. But sort of given all these hours are spent on inspection, what does the research show in terms of the effectiveness of inspections? There's been quite a lot of research done in this area, but it tends to focus on outcomes such as the injury rate and using administrative data. A lot of the research is being conducted in the United States and tends to be focusing on larger firms and firms within particular industry sectors such as manufacturing. There's only really been a couple of studies done in Canada. There's been a series of systematic reviews done, and they rate the evidence of inspections being effective in reducing injuries from low to very low, moderately strong, and strong if it's inspections with penalties, but low or no evidence for when it's inspections without penalties. So like I said, there's been a couple of studies, one in Ontario and one here in BC, which some of you may have attended the seminar from the partnership's former doctoral student, Dr. Kim McLeod. She did her research here in BC using data from WorkSafeBC. And what she found was the inspections were only associated with reductions in acute injuries for large and service sector firms. And I think she found some indication of effectiveness for inspections with orders, but not inspections without orders. But in terms of research on the characteristics of the inspection officer or other things than just looking at the injury outcomes, there's not been that much work done. There was an interesting study done in Alberta which found that officers using supportive tactics, so like providing rationale and choices, they unsurprisingly issued fewer compliance orders, but they were shown to achieve compliance after fewer visits than inspecting officers that use coercive tactics, so like more like pressure and deadlines. But to our knowledge, there's very little or no research which has actually looked at, speaking with the employer and the worker representatives and getting their perspective of the overall inspection experience, and like how they would rate the officer's communication and whether it actually resulted in changes in their workplace hazard management. So based on this, the kind of main objective of our study is to identify what factors best determine hazard management changes in workplaces following workplace safety inspections by WorkSafeBC. So to address this, we made use of this inspection experience and impact survey. So this is a biannual telephone survey conducted by Ipsos on behalf of WorkSafeBC. So Ipsos is like a third-party market research company. It samples these workplaces based on a randomization of all inspection reports submitted to WorkSafeBC in the previous 6 months of that survey taking place. But it does exclude inspections resulting in penalties and workplaces where there was fatalities. And then WorkSafeBC has made revisions to this survey over time, but in particular in 2018, that's when the partnership worked in collaboration with WorkSafeBC to develop new questions aimed at determining factors that changed following the inspection. So more specifically, we have 2 questions which were reworded and 2 new questions which were introduced in that wave of the survey. So firstly, the reworded question was, how would you rate the officer's ability to explain ways that your firm or your employer can manage hazards at the workplace? And this provided an answer on a Likert scale ranging from very poor to very good. Another question was, how would you rate the officer's ability to explain changes that need to be made to your firm or by your employer in order to be compliant with regulation? And this was answered in the same kind of scale. And then our main outcome variable, which we'll be exploring today, is did the inspection lead to changes in how hazards are managed at the workplace? And this could vary from no change to minor change, moderate change, and major changes. And then lastly, we have an open text question, which was related to that. So as a result of the inspection, what changes to health and safety have been made at your workplace? So we've done some work with this question, but I'm not going to be going into that in today's presentation. So some details on our actual survey sample numbers. We focused on respondents with valid responses to these key questions. So that reduced our sample from just under 1,800 to like 1,578 respondents. And those were based on surveys conducted in the last quarter of 2018, first 2 quarters of 2019. And because the survey captures a range of sectors and job roles and types of inspections, we have a good representation across different job categories. And primarily we're focused on like testing the validity of these new, validity and the variability of these new questions. So we started off with descriptive statistics, then we moved into multinomial logistic regression models due to the kind of categorical nature of our main outcome variable. So we wanted to model what factors were associated or best predicted the respondent reporting minor change, moderate change, or major change relative to reporting no change. And that included variables in the survey which were job related, like the job role. We looked at the sector. There's also inspection related characteristics, whether or not the inspection was a planned or response inspection, whether there was orders that were given out by the prevention officer during the inspection, whether there was a post-inspection discussion. And then we have more kind of survey related, or more like, I say survey related, what I mean is more like ratings of the communication of the officers. So like whether they were rated as good or very good in terms of ability to explain ways to manage hazards or be compliant with regulation. So I'll move on to our first kind of results slide here. And this is looking at how would you rate the officer's ability to explain ways that your firm, your employer, can manage hazards at the workplace. So what we find here is that like there's good rating, like over 30% of the respondents rated the officers as good and almost 60% very good. So over 90% is good or very good. So in general, this could be seen as a good thing from WorkSafeBC that the respondents they think the officers are doing a good job in terms of explaining ways to manage hazards. When we move on to the other variable on the officer's communication, it's we see a similar result actually. We see that again, it's like over 90%. If anything, it's even a higher percentages for the good and very good in terms of explaining ways to be compliant with regulation. So I'll take this opportunity to ask you, what percentage of respondents do you think reported a change in workplace hazard management as a result of an inspection? So just any type of change, not necessarily moderate or major, but just any change.
All right, I think we have enough for a stable estimate of the population.
Great.
There's the results.
Yeah, well, I can say that the 47%, they're correct. It falls within this greater than 50, less than or equal to 75%. And let me just close that. So more specifically, it's like pretty much 70% reported some level of change. You can see similar proportions for no changes, minor and moderate, just around the kind of 30% mark, and 10% reported a major change. So I'm now going to focus on the association between this variable and other variables in relation to it, such as like the respondent, the inspection characteristics, and also the rating of the officer's communication. So here we see the job role. You can see that there's fairly good variability across the different jobs, with similar kind of around a 30% or slightly less for reporting no change. But there does appear to be some kind of gradient happening with sort of job seniority and reporting a change. So if you were to think of grouping the kind of moderate and major changes, you can see that sort of further down the chain of command is a greater likelihood to be reporting a moderate or major change. You see bigger differences, particularly with the major change. You've got as much as 12% reporting a major change among workers, but only 5% for owners. Another important factor to consider is the industry sector of the workplace. So you can see that there's kind of sampling across a whole range of industries in the BC economy. But unsurprisingly, we have larger numbers in the service sector, manufacturing, construction. But as I said earlier, this is kind of based on drawing from a sample of the inspection reports. These sectors tend to have like they have higher injury rates, so they tend to be targeted. So that's why we have those larger numbers. And then we have we've ranked these sectors in descending order based on the percentage of their no change. So you can see that the sector with the least amount of changes is actually primary resources, with 36% of them reporting no change. In contrast to say like trades, which not to be mistaken with like construction related trades, this would be retail and wholesale trade. It's only 20% reported no change. You just see some large differences when you start digging down into kind of what major changes and not. So as much as 11% reported major change for trade, but as little as only 4% for transportation. Moving on into whether it's a planned or response inspection, here you do see some differences. You see, particularly for major and moderate changes, you see larger shares among the response inspection in contrast to the planned inspection. And then thinking of order type, there's a quite large differences that we're seeing here, which are not that surprising. When you think about it, when a firm is given an order, they're going to have to make changes in order to be in compliance with whatever part of the regulation that they violated. So So it's unsurprising that you have as much as 41% with no change, and then as little as, 16% and no change by the time you have a follow-up order. But there's a nice kind of gradient that we're observing here. And then in terms of post-inspection discussion, we see that more than double the respondents actually had a post-inspection discussion. This is going to be also related to the types of whether or not the inspections have orders, because if you have orders or you have major changes, you're more likely to have some kind of discussion with the prevention officer after the inspection anyway. But we do see an association between having a discussion and having reported changes. And then after aggregating those first two results slides I showed you, looking at the rating of the officer's ability to explain ways to manage hazards, you can see that as this is rated higher, so good or very good, level of communication is associated with greater level of change. And we also see the same in terms of the other variable on the explaining ways to be compliant with regulation, although the results are not quite as the differences are not quite as large here. You'll be glad to know that this is the last stack bar chart I'm going to show you, because this is the last of the descriptive results. We did look at other variables in the survey data, but we were not showing them today because they don't really show any clear associations or predictive power in terms of workplace change. But we looked at things like union status, the quarter in which the survey took place. We did have access to whether the number of orders that were given with some inspections, and that behaved in a similar way as the order type that we saw earlier. But that was just a subset of the data. So the next slides I'm going to show you are based on the fully adjusted multinomial logistic regression results, retaining only the variables which had a chi-square statistic of less than 0.15. So this can be a little bit complicated, so I'm going to try and walk you through it. But these are the estimates from the job role, adjusting for these other characteristics. And so along the y-axis, you've got the odds ratio of reporting a change in workplace hazard management as a result of the inspection. The reference categories are being no change. So an odds ratio of greater than 1 indicates that there's some level of either minor change, moderate change, or major change. We've got the 95% confidence intervals with the lines here. So when they overlap with 1, indicates there's no sort of meaningful change. And then within each of these categories, we also have used owners as a reference group. So what you can see is that among minor changes, there isn't really much of a difference being observed here. And the same is also for moderate changes. But then when we do look at major changes, we find that managers are, relative to owners, are 2 times more likely to report a major change. And then supervisors are like 2.5 times more likely, and then workers are 3 times more likely. So we see this sort of consistency with the descriptive results we were showing earlier, holding other variables accountable in the model. And then this slide is structured in the same way, but focusing on the estimates specific to the inspection itself. So starting off with the planned versus response, you see that no real difference for minor, but for moderate and major, a response inspection is associated with a higher odds of reporting minor or moderate or major changes. And then the very large differences we see are among the order type. And you can see it across all levels of change. Compared to no orders, initiating orders 2 times more likely, 2.5 times more likely for order follow-up. And then you see, 5 times more likely for order follow-ups for moderate, and almost 6 times, 5.5 times for order follow-up for major changes. So clearly there's a strong association between orders given and changes being made in workplaces. And then for your post-inspection discussion, we do see there is an effect, but it's really not that big, and it's not really observed for the major changes. And this is the last results slide here, and then this is just focusing in on the rating of the officer's ability to explain ways to manage hazards and explain ways to be compliant with regulation. And again, we see the consistency with what we saw in the descriptive statistics, that there was larger variation occurring with this first question here. And you can see that compared to a very poor to average rating, if you rate the officers as good or very good at communicating, it's leading to an increased odds ratio of reporting minor changes, moderate changes, and major changes, albeit with quite imprecise estimates here with the very wide confidence intervals. We don't really see the effect for the question related to officers' ability to explain ways to be compliant with the regulation. And actually, we see this sort of slightly unusual kind of finding here, where among major changes, that the rating of good leads to a lower likelihood of reporting a major change than when it's very poor to average. But that kind of corresponds with what was shown in that stacked bar chart. Yeah, I'm already at the summary of the findings, but it's yeah, basically what the results suggest is that inspections do result in positive changes. We have 70% of the respondents of the survey reported that there was at least some level of workplace hazard management change as a result of the inspection. And we saw from the rating of the officer's ability to explain ways to manage hazards and be compliant with regulation that generally there's very good rating. It's like over 90% is good or very good, and around about the 60% mark is about very good for both of them. So you know, these are positive things for WorkSafeBC, I guess. But it's important to note that, you know, in terms of determining hazard management changes and the overall inspection experience, it does appear to depend on a variety of factors, including kind of workplace characteristics, the inspection and the inspector. So you have, like, within the workplace, you've got the job role. You can clearly see that there's a kind of gradient, a difference in what's being reported based on the workers versus what's being reported based on the owners. We can see that there's fewer changes being reported in particular sectors like primary resources as opposed to manufacturing and trades. And then there's a clear, like, large differences in terms of the inspection characteristics. So the response inspections lead to more changes, and especially the inspections with orders lead to some very large, you know, odds ratios for reporting changes. And then, yeah, like I said earlier, the communication seems to be key here. So, you know, being effective communicators and also having time to have a post-inspection discussion with respondents does appear to have a, you know, have an impact in terms of making changes in workplace hazard management. Yeah, it's important to note that there's strengths and limitations to the study. This was our kind of first go at working with this survey data. And to our knowledge and looking on the literature, it seems to be the first to our knowledge that actually, you know, examines factors of inspection experience and how they're associated with changes in workplace hazard management. Most studies on inspections tend to be using administrative data where you're not going to get this kind of perspective. And due to the nature of the survey, we are capturing a wide range of workplaces that were inspected, as well as respondents within the workplaces, as well as different types of inspections as well. But it's important to note there are limitations. So due to the sampling strategy of the survey, it's not a true representative sample of all inspections conducted by WorkSafeBC. It excludes workplaces with fatalities, it excludes inspections with penalties. But like I said earlier, that penalties are very rare. It's about 1 in 100. So it's unlikely that would bias the results that much. Another thing is also thinking about the kind of response rate of the survey. I'm not actually sure what the response rate is. I haven't obtained access to kind of the non-response. So it would be interesting to look at the kind of characteristics of the respondents or the workplaces for those that that were not surveyed compared to those that made it into the survey. And perhaps the biggest limitation is that we have a self-reported measure, so it's kind of it's prone to recall bias. You could have up to a 6-month lag between when the survey took place and when the inspection took place. There's subjective measures. You might find that the actual what a worker respondent considers as a major change is very different to a major change of an employer, even within the same workplace. There's also other things which would be useful to consider, like variables that weren't available in this data set we worked with, like maybe if there's additional characteristics of the respondent and the prevention officer, maybe even just in terms of demographics. So if there's big gender or age differences between them, if that leads to any kind of bias in the results. Also, maybe if you had access to more characteristics of the officer and whether they have issued, inspection officers that issue lots of orders have different ratings of communication versus those that don't. Also things like the firm size, like other characteristics of the workplace, which we didn't have access to in this wave of the analysis. So despite the descriptive nature of the results, they do have implications for WorkSafeBC. They highlight areas where the inspection experience may be improved. So one of these areas is effective communication of the prevention officers. We saw that there was a kind of independent effect of good or very good communication, particularly with regards to explaining how hazards are managed at the workplace, and also having like post-inspection discussions. We also identified sectors where there appear to be fewer changes as a result of the inspection. And that might not be a reflection of the inspection itself. It's more to do with the dynamics of of the industry. So you think of like construction, transportation, primary resources. These are perhaps more dynamic workplaces which are changing frequently, as opposed to like a more static, fixed environment, like a manufacturing facility where it's easy to implement occupational health and safety management systems and make changes in hazard management practice. Yeah, so we're doing ongoing research in this area. We have been given access to additional waves of data. So we will have quarter 3 and 4 of 2019 and quarter 1 and 2 of 2020. And with this, we have access to a firm size variable, which we're going to start unpacking. But perhaps most interestingly is, we're all living and working in a pandemic. This seminar is all online. This pandemic has introduced challenges for WorkSafeBC and workplaces for keeping safe work environments. So WorkSafeBC implemented requirement for workplaces to have COVID safety plans. So in our survey, our survey that we used, there's a variable which differentiates between inspections which were COVID-19 specific inspections versus those that weren't. So those that were focusing on these safety plans versus just more regular inspections. And because of trying to reduce COVID exposures, they introduced telephone-based inspections in March. So we have a variable which is interaction type, I think it's called, and that differentiates between inspections that were in person and by phone. So we have actually done some analysis with that, but I'm not going to share the results of that with you today, but I can let you know that we will be publishing a research brief of that new analysis shortly, so keep an eye on our website. So in addition to the ongoing research, there's other future opportunities which we may consider, and that's range from maybe further development of some of the research questions in the survey. Like we did before, working with WorkSafeBC, we can maybe help refine how the questions are asked, and maybe switch some of the kind of open text questions to categorical ones so we can more easily kind of conduct analysis. Or we can develop a coding scheme, say for the open text question, to sort of test the validity of the other rating of changes in workplace hazard management. What I'm most interested in actually is linking the survey data to employer and claim level data. So if you focused on firms that have been inspected and had access to their injury records, it'd be interesting to do a comparison between firms that had good ratings, like rated major or moderate changes, for example, in their hazard management, and how that associates with their actual injury, to see how closely aligned the subjective and kind of objective measures are. Lastly, I'd just like to acknowledge that this was funded by WorkSafeBC. We use WorkSafeBC data, and all inferences, opinions, and conclusions are ours and not of the data steward. And I'd like to stop there.